We've already looked at the first two ancestors of the Greeks from a chronological point of view. We looked at quickly the Cycladic civilization in the third millennium before Christ on the islands, Circle Islands, in the middle of the Aegean Sea. And then we took a much closer look at the Minoans, a civilization that came to be in the first half of the second millennium before Christ, from around 2000 to 1450, and of which we know a lot more about. We know their myths. We know a lot because we have found their palace at Knossos. And now we move to the third major Aegean civilization that stands at the foundation of the Greeks as we know them. They're called the Mycenaeans. And they get their name, the Mycenaeans, after the citadel, the fortress, that was the citadel of one of its greatest kings or leaders, King Agamemnon, who was king of the fortress city of Mycenae. Thus, Mycenaeans, after one of the great cities of the Mycenaean culture, Mycenae. The Mycenaeans pop up on the scene of history around 1600 before Christ and last for about 500 years. They will be brought down and they will disappear when a new invading force called the Dorians, we believe, arrive in this part of the world and overrun them. The Mycenaeans are not like the Cycladic or Minoan cultures. They are mainland people, even though they will learn to sail as well, of course. But they inhabit what we call the Greek mainland instead of the Greek islands of Crete or the Dodecanese, the 12 islands of the Cycladic culture. They are not a unified country. There is no unified country of Greece in the ancient world. There is today, of course, but in ancient times there was, like we saw in Mesopotamia, a group of kings, monarchies that are based in this case, not in city-states, but in hill fortresses. You have to think in smaller terms of very fortified, heavily fortified, strong-walled hill fortresses and palace complexes. And this is what the Mycenaean culture will be about. Here is a quick look at where in the Mediterranean these Mycenaean fortresses pop up. You will find hopefully Mycenae right there in the middle. That's where the great king Agamemnon, but there are nearby other ones like Argos and Tiryns, and up in the northern part, Delphi and Orchomenos, and of course Marathon and Athens and Gla. Those are just where these fortresses of Mycenaean culture pop up. And they will all be called Mycenaean after the most famous fortress is made so by the great King Agamemnon. I will go ahead and mention that Achilles, who goes down, of course, in the Iliad and in modern-day movie versions of that story, Achilles is king of a Mycenaean kingdom on the island of Ithaca. So that's a real island. So again, we have to, in a sense, extricate mythology from real history. But there is real history and real geography, and there are real fortresses. And this is where actually we must start. It was all thought to be mythology, the story of Achilles and Agamemnon and other Greek heroes, until a guy by the name of Heinrich Schliemann, a German-Russian, decided with his extensive money, his extensive power, he decided to research and to excavate the geography and the tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Heinrich Schliemann was an amateur archaeologist. He did not have not only the modern day equipment and abilities and technology, but basically he just set out with hired hands with shovels to dig up what were thought to be the places where these Mycenaean warriors, Achilles, Agamemnon, Diomedes, Ajax, and others, had once lived and operated. Mr. Schliemann was convinced that the Greek epics, the Greek stories that were contained in the twin epic poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by a poet in antiquity called Homer, a Greek poet called Homer. He was convinced that they were not all made up. They were grounded actually in fact, many of them. And so he took his extensive funds. He was very wealthy through business adventures, and he decided to begin excavating areas, and he was successful. He followed indications, geographical indications in the Iliad and the Odyssey and the poems, and went and found the palaces of King Agamemnon and Mycenae, and he found the site of the ancient war of Troy, the great enemy of the Mycenaean warriors, and the site of the great expedition that had happened in the 13th century before Christ. So now we can extricate, thanks to Mr. Schliemann, the Mycenaean culture out of mythology and bring it into real history. What do we know now about the Mycenaean culture, this early ancestor of the Greeks? They were a warrior culture. They were a war-based culture. They conducted raids. They were frequently in warfare. So they're very different from the Minoans. The Minoans were more into trade, while the Mycenaean culture were warlike. That doesn't mean that they were unsophisticated. The art and the pottery, and indeed the weapons even that we have found of the Mycenaeans, are very beautifully made, show great degrees of goldsmithing, silversmithing, and great sophistication in their abilities to make weapons, pottery, etc. So just because they are warlike does not mean they are brutish. In fact, we are impressed by the degree of sophistication. The greatest warlike expedition ever conducted by the Mycenaean warriors was, of course, the Trojan War. And now we can pinpoint a century in which this took place. So in general, we place the Trojan War now in the 13th century before Christ, what in the middle of the 5 centuries in which the Mycenaean culture comes to be present. And of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the 2 epic poems written by a poet called Homer much later, and I'll talk about that in a separate thing. Homer lives about 5 centuries after the Trojan War, but he inherits the tales of the great military expedition in which a conglomeration of Greek kings, Mycenaean kings, under the the leadership of Agamemnon, heads across the Aegean Sea with 1,000 black ships and sails to lay siege and to punish the Trojans, their enemies in the Mediterranean, in the Aegean Sea. Their enemies are attacked, and this great expedition against Troy is conducted. The peak of the Mycenaean culture will be right around that time of the Trojan expedition, the Trojan War. The collapse of the Mycenaean culture will happen, as we said, around 1100, when a new kid on the block, the Dorians, seemingly arrives. I'll tell you more about Trojan War as we look at Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey in a separate lecture. But what I will say is this, as you look at the Mask of Agamemnon. Mr. Schliemann, the amateur archaeologist, the Russian German businessman, will go to excavate the citadel of Mycenae, and he will strike gold, meaning he will find some tombs within the walls of the citadel of Mycenae that had not been raided by tomb raiders. One of the things that he finds is an amazing treasure trove of gold masks. It was the evidently tradition culture of the Mycenaean warriors to lay over the face of their deceased kings very soft, malleable 24 karat gold, so very soft, to where they would make an imprint of the face of the deceased king. So here it is. Mr. Schliemann, when he found this particular mask, he found several, he declared to the world, "I found the face of Agamemnon." So he's pulling Agamemnon out of mythology into history by showing an actual face. We now know that he was wrong about the identification. This most probably does not belong to Agamemnon, but belongs to the great-great-great-grandfather of Agamemnon, probably a couple of centuries before, in the 15th. That said, we see that the kings of Mycenaean kings had mustaches and facial hair, and we also see the practice of sewing the eyelids together in the sleep of death. So there you go, a face of a Mycenaean king. We also have, thanks to Mr. Schliemann, found in the tombs the weapons. They were a warrior culture. These are not just symbolic weapons like we saw the double axe with the Minoans. These are actually very sophisticated weapons of the Minoan warriors in front of you. And you also see beautiful gold cups and other artifacts from the tombs of that were found in Mycenae. And so again, we are amazed by the artistry and the goldsmithing and silversmithing of, besides the iron making, or excuse me, the bronze making of the Mycenaean warriors of the Greek tombs. Now, those artifacts were found in this tomb. There are two types of tombs that were found inside and outside of the fortress of Mycenae. There were shaft tombs, and these tombs, the shaft in the sense of elevator type, go straight down, contained about 17 different remains, bodies, adults, children, babies as well, of the Mycenaean warriors. And the walls that you see around them were to separate the living from the dead. So basically, inside the city cemetery had a wall to separate the land of the living from the land of the dead. So here again, the shaft tombs, here are the walls that separated those shafts, where the aristocratic remains of kings and family members were buried. Outside of the city of Mycenae, most of the later kings were buried in these gigantic beehive tombs. So shaft tombs were found associated with the Mycenaean warriors inside the city, and then many beehive tombs, man-made hills. They were constructed, look like beehives. I'll show you in a minute why. And then they were covered up with dirt. So massive earth-moving efforts to cover up, again, to keep tomb raiders from reaching them. These beehive tombs on the outside of the citadel of Mycenae were found empty, so unfortunately the tomb raiders got there. This is the inside of a beehive tomb. So notice the gigantic stones, some 20 to 30 tons in a post and lintel system to cover up the major entrance, which they would bring the body of the artifacts of the king and keep them inside this round thing, and then cover up with dirt so it looked like a hill, a natural hill. But they were totally constructed. Who knows how long it took to build these. And then they Now they're called beehive because of they come to a point in the top structure, but these are two types of tombs that the Mycenaeans have left behind in time. Now we're going to look in a separate instance at the stories of Achilles, Agamemnon, as told by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, so that will be in a separate lecture.